does Jacques Lacan have in mind with his notion of the point de caption, or, as has been translated by Bruce Fink, the quilting point? What does he mean by this idea of a type of quilting point or an anchoring point, or, as I prefer, a kind of attachment point that operates in language? Well, this question became pertinent to me because in an earlier lecture I was discussing a Lacanian approach to psychotic speech, the speech of psychotically structured subjects, which sometimes evinces one of two different forms. One of those is, and people who've watched the previous lecture will remember this idea that there are types of psychotic speech which seem to be very concrete, almost overly literalized. I gave some examples, but you could conceptualize this in Freudian terms as a type of speech where thing presentations are very important, almost as if the thing presentations of the speech outweigh the word presentations. But nevertheless, don't worry too much about that. Let's just keep in mind this idea that there's some types of speech which are overly concrete. It's almost as if they resist metaphorization. The examples that I gave, one comes from an anecdote that a fellow clinician had shared with me, the idea that in speaking to someone who was psychotically structured, he'd mentioned, well, the more you talk about these people from your past, it feels almost like there's ghosts in the room. And of course, this person didn't hear it as a metaphor, heard it as very literal, and was kind of a little bit worried that there might be ghosts in the room. The other example is one that comes from Daddy Nobis. He mentions that in a certain clinician's work, one person, psychotically structured person, had said that they had felt, or they'd been heard this phrase, that they'd been left out in the cold, and hence they wanted to burn down the building. In other words, the idea of being left out in the cold, not heard in a metaphoric way, but heard in a very literal way. So you'll see then that I've stressed here overly literal, overly concrete instances of speech in the case of psychotic speech, in the case of psychotically structured subjects. I've also noted that this is a type of speech where there seems to be a lack of semantic ambiguity. In other words, in this respect, it's very different from neurotic speech. I've also added here this notion of the eye twister. And of course, those of you who are familiar with Freud's work will recall that there's an example that Freud himself utilizes where there's a patient who talks about being seen by an eye twister. And an eye twister, this German term for someone who's a deceiver, and she then says, oh, I've got a problem, my eyes are now twisted. And again, a very literal use of language. So that's one tendency, one type that we might see, one type of speech that we might see in the case of psychosis. Now, for me, this started to become important because I also made reference to another type of psychotic speech, which sounds like it almost totally contradicts this one. This is a mode of overly literalized, overly concretized, you could say, speech. On the other hand, we have also instances of speech where the language seems not to have been anchored, where there's a type of psychotic speech, maybe some people would refer to this as the type of nonsensical word salad, where this speech, this signifies the words seem to be free-floating. They seem to kind of progressively link on and give associations with other words. In other words, almost exactly the opposite. Rather than being overly concretized, here we have words leading on to more words, words which sound like other words, which create links, assonance, various types of words leading to other words, in sense that you can say that the signifiers seem to be free-floating, not properly embedded. And of course, in the lecture, when I mentioned these two types of speech, it seemed to me that this is a contradiction. Are these types of speech we could assume to exist within the same subject? Surely this contradiction doesn't easily get resolved. Is speech either overly concretized, or is it too free-floating? So what we could say here then is that in both of these cases, we have a disruption of the conventional relationship of words to meanings. We have a disruption of the conventional relationship of signifiers to signifieds. Let's just keep that in mind. Words to meanings. It's been disrupted. on the one hand, you could say it's almost like there's too much of the thing presentations, of the signifieds, of meaning being very concretized, whereas on the other hand, you could say signifiers are too slippery. They seem to lack an anchoring to signifieds. And this side, we've got this constant chaotic slipping of signified under signifier. Too much signifier on this side, too much signified on that side. So these sound like two contradictory states, but of course, for Lacan, they're both the result of what he refers to as the fact that the big other is excluded in cases of psychosis. Now, in order to make that point and to show how, despite that they seem to be very different states, they both have the same underlying cause, let's briefly think about how speech operates in, as it were, everyday neurotic speech. In everyday neurotic speech, for language to work, or as I put it here, for the production of a necessary illusion of a fixed meaning, what needs to happen is there needs to be a relatively stable, conventionalized relationship between the words that I'm speaking, the signifiers, and their meanings, the signifieds. If that happens, then I'm able to communicate and people can more or less understand because there's a conventionalized and stable relationship between words and their meanings. Precisely the thing that seems to have been disrupted in states of psychosis, according to Lacan. But importantly, although there is a stabilized and conventional relationship between words and meaning, this is, after all, Lacanian psychoanalysis, which means that there will always nonetheless be some relationship of ambiguity. If there weren't some relationship of ambiguity, then jokes wouldn't work, then slippages wouldn't be possible, then the semantic ambiguities, which are so characteristic of neurotic speech, would also not be possible. So Lacan needs to come up with some concept to try and get a sense of how we might have this kind of minimal anchoring. The point de caption, Bruce Fink translates as the quilting point or buttonhole. He gives us a little drawing, and to try to keep things fairly brief, I'll try and explain what it is, but we'll give a different analogy. For me, it works simply to think about a kind of provisional or minimal anchoring point. The initial idea of a quilting point, of a button tie, is that if you imagine a certain piece of furniture that's got a whole lot of stuffing in, say like a big pillow, that needs to be held close to another piece of furniture or another piece of upholstery within the same sofa, for example, we would need not simply to attach all the pillows to the framework in a very rigid way, but rather you would need a kind of quilting point, a buttonhole, to attach certain parts of the sofa to one another so that they could move a little bit in the upholstery without being too rigidly constrained, so they could permit a certain amount of movement. This, hence, is the notion of the quilting point. For me, a suitable analogy, one I've given before in a different context, is just the idea of anchoring. If a ship is to be anchored at sea, if it were rigidly, absolutely rigidly anchored like a column of concrete, that wouldn't work, because as the ship is moved by the sea, that would eventually cause a kind of rupture or a breaking of the concrete pillar. So there needs to be some possibility of movement. There needs to be some possibility of ambiguity, and that's what the notion of the quilting point is trying to suggest. So let's turn directly to two quotes from Lacan, just to make sure that we have got what he's on about. The quilting point, he says, the anchoring point, the point of attachment, we might consider it, these are points at which the signified and the signifier are knotted together. In other words, they hold meaning. They make meaning viable, conventionalized, culturally appropriate forms of meaning. At these points, signified and signifier are knotted together. Hence, there is not a constant slippage of signifieds, meanings, under signifiers, words. In psychotic experience, by contrast, the signifier and the signified present themselves in completely different form. Or, put differently, in psychotic experience, words, on the one hand, and meanings present themselves in a completely divided form. This is Lacan's, one of his concluding thoughts towards the end of his third seminar. So we can just then maybe add one further quote to that, and then we can conclude our little mini talk on what is the quilting point. This is a quote from Bruce Fink's very useful A Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis, a book that I've cited from before. And of course, what he's going to do is he's going to bring this idea of the quilting point, the knotting point, the attachment point, the anchoring of signified and signifier. He's going to bring it back to the idea that we previously discussed of the paternal metaphor. So here's the quote. The result of the paternal metaphor, he says, is to tie a specific meaning to particular words without regard to an absolute referent. And that's important. There's not an absolute referent. There's not, as he puts it, and mythical absolute reality beyond the reality being created. Words are relatively anchored to meanings, and this is an important element through which we can distinguish the apparent functioning of neurotic speech where the quilting points are operating. And of course you could ask how many, but it seems that there's a minimal number of them, as opposed to psychotic speech where those quilting points don't function properly. For Fink, here's his little diagram. For Fink, this is, and indeed for Lacan, this is an operation of the paternal metaphor. Let's conclude then and say that this is a useful way of attending to helping us think about speech in the clinic, and hence this whole concept is useful for thinking about clinical diagnosis. But let's also just remember this concept and some of the concepts and ideas here will return in later Lacan when it starts to talk about a master signifier. A master signifier again, which is able to kind of hold or quilt or hold together, anchor a certain kind of meaning.